at the school right now, and really looking at, in lack of other guidance, what is it that the school would need to know to determine if you're able to continue to operate? How much staff do you need in each area? What are your critical levels for where you have to stop in school teaching? So really looking at where your current capacity is and where your limits are, and just reviewing that, and then waiting for the additional guidance to come out. I know the state as a whole right now is really looking at when schools should exclude people for symptoms and when schools should close. And those are the two big topics that we're looking at right now. And there's just not enough information to make a real credible decision based on current circumstances. So those are the top two subjects that we are thinking about. We are looking at currently the way the spread of COVID is looking is not great. So that's where the, it's too early to tell comes in, where we want to wait a little bit to see how things trend before we can make some more educated decisions.
Thanks, Zach. Go ahead, Faye, were you going to say something? No. Zach, can you restate, you said there were two things, and I was trying to write down and I missed that you're really looking at.
Oh yeah, sure. So it's basically when schools should close, what criteria to look at, and when people should be excluded for symptoms, basically how long people should be excluded for symptoms. So looking at your plans, even if someone doesn't have a positive COVID test, they may still be excluded if they have any symptoms related to COVID. And so how long should they be excluded? When can they return? So it's the exclusion and then the school closures.
Thank you. And I know you were participating on our health and operations and facilities team, so I appreciate you doing that. We'll open up for just maybe a few questions before we break out. Does anybody have any questions or need clarification from Zach regarding Department of Health guidelines?
Zach, I've got a goofy one.
Have at it.
Discussion of allergies.
Yeah. So allergies are really difficult. I don't think I can count how many times someone said, oh, I thought it was allergies, and it was COVID. So it's really difficult. And what we look at is kind of the person's patterns, historical patterns, and what's normal to them. So if we identify something that's not normal, then we act on that. It's really difficult, honestly, with allergies because we can't really trust that it is, unfortunately. But it really does depend on exposure and symptoms. So if someone had no identifiable exposure, no contact with anyone else, they did an activity where they know that typically gives them allergy symptoms, we can look at that. It's kind of a case-by-case scenario.
Can I ask a quick question, Zach? This is Sarah Perry.
Yeah, certainly.
So I had two questions. One is there any talk of partnering with the Department of Health for testing? Should someone in a classroom come positive or anything like that? Is it going to be through the public health avenue, or is it going to be relying on everybody's private doctors to arrange testing? And or is there any discussion about that at a state level? And then secondly, are you guys talking about kind of statewide policies as far as what the case per 100,000 would need to be for in-person versus not? And does that mean in your city or in your county or in the state as a whole? And are we going to set guidance like that? Or yeah, what's the plan there? Thanks.
Yeah, so your first question about testing. Currently, the Whatcom County Health Department does have staffing capacity to do kind of a response testing. And we've done it before in long-term cares and other business settings where there's identified case and a lot of potential exposures. So it's unlikely that we'd use the state. We'd probably do it ourselves, where we'd either create some type of a testing event related to an exposure, most likely. And of course, utilize people as primary care providers. If you can go in and see a provider quickly and get a test, that's great. Takes burden off of other resources, but otherwise it would likely be a response from the Whatcom County Health Department on a case-by-case scenario, but that's the likely scenario. As far as looking at some of the other policies and rates, we are looking at a statewide level, but a lot of counties don't necessarily agree on what that should be. And so, although we would like a statewide kind of unified response, usually what happens is counties opt in to do their own, especially if they can be less restrictive. So that's still in discussion. And we definitely prefer that the state has a unified response, but even between, Western Washington and Eastern Washington, it's so different.
Of course.
So that's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys, do you think at a county level, then the district will hear sorry for the follow-up, we'll get some guidance from the Whatcom County Health Department as far as like when it reaches this point, we need to pull the plug or vice versa?
Yeah, I think we'll try to get some general consistency from the state and then adopt to our own depending on the circumstances.
Okay.
One point to add is that we are trying to create more of an official school response team for Whatcom County to have more dedicated staff, especially going into the fall, to respond to schools and to be able to provide some of that guidance more specifically. So if there's a generic guidance, we can probably take that and say, and here's what we're going to do here. So we do have that team being formed, and I'll provide them as resources to this meeting as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. Any other questions for Zach?
I have a question.
Sure.
Zach, when could we meet in person? 50 of us get together and meet in person. What criteria do we have to meet to make that happen?
Oh, that's a good question.
Thank you.
All phases are on hold right now for transitioning. So there's probably a science component and a political component that are very dependent on certain guidelines being followed. Right now, all the phases are on hold, and in the phase we're in, we can't have more than, I think, 5 people. And so the first thing that has to happen is the governor allows us to move into the next phase. And right now, no applications are being submitted. So that's the first part that has to happen. And then we have to meet all the criteria in order to move into the next phase, which is based on testing capacity and % positive and outbreaks if we're having multiple outbreaks. So there's a lot of criteria we have to meet in addition to it being opened up again to move into the next phase.
Thank you.
I can say based on current trends, it's very unlikely that will be anytime soon.
So what phase would we need to be in to start school?
That's, even though we have these phases, I think exceptions will be made. And it may not be what the current phase description is, but we are having to adapt and realize how important that education, in-person education really is. So I don't have a clear answer for you, but I honestly think there will be exceptions made, even if it doesn't line with the current phase we're in now.
Can I clarify or ask a question? So what you're saying, Zach, is that phases are not the ultimatum. Like we could be in phase 2 with groups of no more than 5 people outside of your household per week and still going to in-person school. Is that correct?
I'm saying that's possible.
Okay.
And that would be based on what the governor and as well as the Department of Health decides counties can do. I've already seen where they've made exceptions in other areas, so I think that's something that could definitely happen. But it's hard to predict anything right now.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. We appreciate you being willing to talk with us today and share updates as well as take questions. And your overall participation on this group is really helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Zach is participating on our facilities and health group as well. So if you have additional questions, you can direct them towards that subgroup for follow-up. So the next person that we are going to hear from today, and like Faye said, we're just going to spend a few minutes together tonight before we're breaking into subgroups, but there are just a few important updates we want to make sure that you have, is John Fairbairn. And John is our Executive Director of Human Resources. And so he has a lot to do right now in terms of staffing and trying to understand kind of the implications of all of this and with our folks. So John, can you give us a brief update on where we are with some of our collaborative conversations with stakeholders?
Well, I think that's the key right there, Kelly, is that we felt really good. We're in the process of meeting with each of our employee groups, and employee groups in our organization are identified as unions. And we've met today with our Teamsters union, who represents our transportation department, and we've met with FEA. And basically we've laid out this meeting with the purpose of, we want to hear from you. We want to know what your hopes are for the reopening, what your concerns are, what you're hearing, what you know, and we've just been trying to listen, and we had the first two today. What I'd like to share with you is just the top things that came out of the meeting. So they're an hour long, there's lots of conversation, there's lots of topics that we get through, but I'd like to share the top ones. So with Teamsters, number one, before I hardly even got the question out of my mouth, they said safety. They're worried about enforcing social distancing. They're worried about masks. They're worried about anything that would impact the safety of the kids and of particularly the drivers that are out on the road with them. And related to that is the whole idea. Our buses are been screened, and they aren't getting onto the bus sick, and that's doubly important if we consider that once the kids get off the bus, they're going to go into every classroom in the school. If we had transmission on a bus, it's in some ways even more worrisome than transmission in a classroom, where conceivably we could be keeping the same unit of kids together. That certainly isn't going to be the case coming off the bus. They're also concerned about employee illness, what happens in that case, which kind of reminds me of what Zach was saying, but also are we going to have the sub capacity to cover bus drivers if there is significant illness? And I saw that Tammy put that question up as far as teachers go too. So we have the same concern with that group. And also what happens with somebody's leave if they're sick, either with COVID or can't go to work because we don't know if they have COVID. And then the last thing that we talked about that they have some worries about, and I don't know how tightly any of these groups are going to work on this, but is if we're doing mostly distance learning, what happens with our jobs? So just the real community concern that we've heard all through our organization, they're rightly worried about as well. Also talked with FEA, and it was actually just terrific. They'd done a survey, and so we asked this question, and they had some very definitive answers for that. It was very helpful. Their number one issue that came out, which will kind of be on the teaching and learning side, is managing workload. With a hybrid model, we're trying to do 3 different things all at once. How do we manage a teacher's workload during that time? I'm doing in class learning, and then I'm trying to do distance or remote learning at the same time. The second most important thing from their survey was, and goes along with number 1 from the Teamsters, which is enforcing of the CDC or Department of Health and L&I guidelines for distancing, masks. Again, I'm trying to eliminate any place we can eliminate or reduce the chance of transmission, that we're doing what we can to do that. And then the third thing, it probably goes into every single group that we have. They, along with, I think, our community, every employee group wants really clear guidance on just a laundry list of things that are potential problems. How do we do lunches? How do we clean shared equipment? How do we deliver the curriculum if we're not there with the kids? The complexity of the middle school, high school schedule with changing classes, and how are we going to handle that? Music, extracurricular, the list goes on as far as all of the things that probably the groups are working on. Later this week, we meet with SEIU, which is our maintenance and our custodial staff, and PSE, which is our food service and our para-educators. And then early next week, we'll meet with our administrative assistants group. So by the time we meet next week, we will have the big ideas from each of our employee groups.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And that's why we just tried to remind folks when I talked about including stakeholders, is we had identified our guiding principles as a group. And so as we're having these conversations, we're intentionally trying to make sure they're aligned to our principles that we established. I also want to remind everyone here tonight, and hopefully you're seeing something that says reopening task force subgroups. John, can you give me a nod? I see you on my screen. Thank you. So for our friends that are joining us for the first time tonight, we have broken up our entire task force into subgroups. And the subgroups that we are currently functioning within are our equity and access group, our communication group, our facilities and operations, as well as health and safety. And that's going to be broken up a little bit more tonight when we break up into our subgroups. A social emotional learning subgroup, as well as the infrastructure subgroup. And the infrastructure is that teaching and learning piece where we're looking at scheduling as well as the high quality education. So these are our groups that are currently functioning. And we have continued to meet with the facilitators of each of these groups. So you can see here that these are the folks and individuals that are primarily responsible for facilitating these groups. And so we've continued to debrief with these individuals as well as talk about next steps in the planning. And so these teams are now kind of functioning somewhat independently in that last week we asked you to identify some action plans and prioritize those. So as you're meeting with your subgroups, that work is happening, you know, within that group, and there'll be opportunities for us to come back together. But we just wanted to remind everybody of our subgroup right now, what subgroups we have, as well as who's responsible for these groups. And I also want to share that we're sometimes trying to be really intentional also to put some of this information up here because, for instance, last time there were several members that asked for the contact information for the subgroup facilitator. but we're also working really hard to make sure all of this information is also posted online for the rest of our community. So should a community member have a question regarding some of the subgroup work, that information is also included on here. So there are a couple reasons why we're doing some of the things we're doing, but it's also trying to hit that larger audience to make sure they have the opportunity to provide feedback or ask clarifying questions if they have those. So we are going to spend a majority of the time here tonight with the subgroups, and after this last slide we're going to send you to your breakout rooms, which Kelly Parsons has arranged for us. But I just wanted to kind of give you the idea what we envision for the next several weeks, just so we can kind of that backwards design with the end in mind. Today our task force is meeting in subgroups. Next week we expect that majority of our time will be spent with our subgroups. Then on 8/4, August 4th, we're asking all of our subgroups to, basically our task force will all meet together and explain kind of the work that you have been doing and your recommendations to this task force. So to the greater task force, there'll be a presentation. And then on 8/11, we're thinking that you might need to go back to your subgroups and potentially refine or any last minute changes. We all know that the guidance is changing on a regular basis too. So, you know, we may need to modify things. And then 8/11 is when we will be asking for the school board to review our plan so we can submit it on the 19th. So we will have quite a bit of time of subgroup work incorporated in the next few meetings. And we also recognize and understand that there's going to have to be quite a bit of work happening, and there is quite a bit of work happening outside of these meetings. So we are looking for feedback from you all as facilitators on what do you need to see, what are questions that you might have. So when we finish our meetings, we can be stepping away and walking away with a task list in preparation for the next meeting. What we identified with our facilitators is that 2 hours a week is definitely not going to be enough to take care of what we need to take care of on, as you know, in these reopening plans. So we are definitely needing your guidance and your expertise as we continue to move forward with these planning efforts. So thank you again. Faye, do you have anything you want to add before we break up people into their subgroups?
No, I think you explained it really well, Kelly. Thank you. The only thing I would add is that we received this week the template from OSPI that we need to complete and send in once we have developed our plan. So come next week at the beginning, we will look to share that with you so you can kind of see the questions that they're asking us. The questions that your facilitators have had and that they've been working with you on last week when we asked them to start prioritizing it, quite honestly, those questions are embedded in the OSPI template. So we are definitely on the right tracks with our work and kind of progressing really well in terms of being able to complete that and get it submitted after we finalize our plans and our school board approves it. So again, thank you. We just really appreciate it.
Okay, Kelly. So if you could go ahead and break us into our groups, that would be great.